Hello and good evening, and welcome to Wildlife from the Wildlife Trusts for February 2026. A warm welcome for a fantastic conversation tonight, which we're calling Treasure or Trouble, and asking the question, should we be mining for metals in the deep seas? And I have a fantastic panel joining us tonight to try and work through this issue. Kaja Stewart is Senior Campaigner at Rise Up for the Ocean. She'll tell you more about that in a little while. Alec Taylor joins us as Director of Policy and Research for Oceana UK. And our very own Ruth Williams, Head of Marine Conservation at the Wildlife Trust, is also joining us. And I hope you appreciate my deep, dark blue shirt I put on specially this morning to mark the fact that we're talking about the wonderful deep seas tonight. And it couldn't be more timely. Just in the last couple of days, I saw newspaper reports that Japan is been exploring in the deep seas for metals as well. Of course, the whole conversation is, the argument is often made, and we'll find out more about it tonight, that we need these metals that you get from the deep seas actually for creating renewables and creating all the kind of technology we need for the so-called clean green economy. That's the argument that's made in support of mining in the deep seas. Of course, the other argument you'll hear quite a lot tonight is just what incredibly precious ecosystems these are, and one of the last places on Earth which really should be protected. But hey, I'm just the chair. I'm here to take your questions and make sure we put as many of them as possible to our fantastic panelists tonight. So let's get on with it. I will go first of all to Ruth Williams, our Head of Marine Conservation at the Wildlife Trust. Good evening, Ruth, and tell us where you're joining us from tonight.
Hi, Greg. Yeah, I'm joining you all from deepest, darkest Cornwall. So yeah, it's been a bit gloomy as ever, incessant rain yet again. But yeah, down here in Cornwall, wouldn't be anywhere else in the UK.
Well, there we are. We've had a nice sunny day here in Cambridge, actually, just to rub
Mm.
it in, Ruth. But anyway, fair enough. So, Ruth, tell us. The UN High Seas Treaty came into force on the 17th of January this year. Of course, a huge, exciting moment. All of us on the panel tonight were at the UN Oceans Conference in Nice last September. We all met each other there, amongst other things. And before you ask, yes, we did go by train for sure. At least we did from the Wildlife Trusts. And the UN High Seas Treaty was sort of like, it was agreed there, and it came into force on 17th of January, just in other words, last month, when we actually saw the last few countries kind of ratifying it. We'll hear more about that. And what's important about it is it's created the first global framework to protect marine life in waters beyond national borders. So we call it the UN High Seas Treaty for short. But if you want the real acronym, it's BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Important because we don't have enough complicated acronyms in the nature conservation sector, so important to have that one. But of course, with that rising demand for metals needed for renewable technologies, pressure is on to mine the deep sea, one of the planet's most fragile and least understood ecosystems. This panel tonight will work us through it. Can we explore whether deep sea mining can support the drive to net zero, or whether protecting these vast, largely untouched ocean habitats should come first? So, Ruth, kick us off. Tell us first of all, why is the deep sea important? I mean, you could say it out of sight, out of mind. We all got this image of what's in the wonderful wildlife in the marine ecosystem near the coast and so on. But what about in the deep sea?
Yeah, exactly. It is out of sight and out of mind in a lot of cases. But to my mind, in the title for tonight's panel is Treasure or Trouble, and the ecosystems in the deep sea are definitely the treasure, not the critical minerals that are being mined for. We all live on this blue planet, but beneath the waves in that deep sea zone is a world that's almost entirely unknown. Deep sea is sort of termed as being anything below 200 meters deep, and it's this realm of almost eternal darkness. There's no sunlight that can reach down there. Really cold temperatures, crushing pressure, and as a consequence, we've evolved some really extraordinary life down there. Incredible, weird and wonderful forms. And actually, the deep sea is one of the Earth's largest habitats. It covers more than 60% of the planet's surface, but we've explored less of it than the surface of the moon. We've got things, creatures and species that have to create their own light. So it's so dark down there. They use a chemical reaction to create bioluminescence, and they use that for things like hunting, for defense, for communication, for camouflage, all sorts of things. We've got little tiny fish, things like lanternfish that are small, like silver-bodied fish that are dotted with these photophores, these little glowing sort of blue-white dots all over them. So when they swim like schools of fish in the dark, they look like falling stars. It really is incredible when you see some of the footage. But they're the most abundant vertebrates on Earth. So those tiny little fish are crucial to some of the global food webs. Other things use bioluminescence. So things like jellyfish. We've got a really deep red jelly with really long trailing tentacles called the Atolla jellyfish. And when that's threatened, it kind of erupts into this spinning halo of electric blue light. And it's sort of given itself the common name of the alarm jellyfish. And that's really to sort of scare off predators. Um, We've got all sorts of other adaptations in the deep sea as well. So things like anglerfish, that sort of fairly iconic deep sea fish with the huge head and the big jaws with the needle teeth that face inwards, a bit like a trap. That glowing lure that it dangles from a little stalk between its eyes, that's to draw prey close enough to be swallowed whole. And there's a number of different species that have got these sorts of adaptations. And I can't talk about deep sea without mentioning Danny's favourite. Danny's behind the scenes tonight, helping to manage the chat. Danny, I know, is a supreme champion for the Dumbo octopus. Now, Dumbo is the cartoon character, and this little octopus looks exactly like that. It's got these two little ear flaps, little fins on the side of its head, which are sensory organs. But it bimbles around. It's quite a small, very soft-bodied octopus that just bimbles around very gently, sort of gracefully feeding on the seabed. So we've got incredible sea life down there. Hydrothermal vents, which are volcanic hotspots, which, most life depends on photosynthesis, but because there's no sunlight down there, instead of being able to generate energy that way, we've got microbes around these hydrothermal vents, which use a thing called chemosynthesis, which draws energy from chemicals, from the hydrogen sulfide, things like that. And they form these kind of deep sea oases. So huge tube worms, crawling with shrimps, massive clams the size of footballs. But I think my main point is that these habitats, these species, although they're incredibly deep, we don't know very much about them. We're still learning all the time. And yet they're sort of supposed to be one of the most productive and unique on Earth.
Brilliant. Well, wonderful descriptions there, Ruth. You had me absolutely mesmerised. That was fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. But tell us a little bit, Ruth, just but briefly, we had a brilliant question from Anthony Bouchard. He said, how well informed are we about this ecosystem in the deep seas to be able to effectively monitor the effects of metal mining? I mean, you've just given a beautiful description there, but presumably that's only what we know is a tiny amount of it. And of course, we don't know what we don't know.
No, exactly. And that's exactly the issue that we're facing here with the prospect of deep sea mining. We don't know what's down there. We are only just starting to find out what lives there. I've just talked about the few things that we do know, but there's vast amounts that we don't. And I said right at the beginning, we know less about the deep sea ocean than we do the surface of the moon. And to my mind, we can't start impacting in the deep sea mining is incredibly impactful. I'll maybe come on to it in a minute, but
Well, tell us about that, Ruth. Why is it so? What is
sure.
the impact of deep sea mining?
So the whole concept of deep sea mining is to fulfill the demand for energies that are used in renewable energy technologies, car batteries, electronics, and the need for that is rising. And there's depleting terrestrial sources, and they're looking at the deep sea as that new frontier to try and get these critical metals for that green transition. Deep sea mining is how they're extracting those minerals from the seabed. So particularly things like manganese, cobalt, nickel, copper, those rare earth elements. And they're usually in the really, really sort of deep abyssal plains, so 4,000 to 6,000 meters deep, really, really deep. And they generally form things like they're called polymetallic nodules. So they're sort of fist-sized nodules of these rare earth elements and metals. But they also form in some of the cobalt-rich crusts and also in some of the hydrothermal vent areas in sort of sulfide crusts as well. And they're especially rich in areas of the Pacific Ocean. And there's an area that's being investigated at the moment where a lot of the exploratory deep sea mining is happening in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and that's kind of between Hawaii and Mexico. Um, but these polymetallic nodules especially take millions of years to form. And the mechanics of the deep sea mining involves industrial scale ships going out, anchoring, and then they deploy these huge machines which go sunk down to the seabed, and they basically cut, scrape, vacuum up the whole seabed down to sort of several centimeters deep. They pump all of that up to the surface, up to the ship on the surface, basically filter out the metallic nodules and the elements that they want, and then chuck the resulting slurry back into the ocean. So in terms of environmental impact, we don't know half the stuff that's down there, but you can, what impact that would have on land, that sucking up all of that seabed. It has the same habitat destruction and biodiversity destruction as it would on land. So you're literally hoovering up the seabed and spitting out the sediment at the end. So a lot of that life is killed outright. It impacts a lot of the feeding and the food webs because a lot of those species are filter feeders. So that sediment plume will impact that. And these sediment plumes that are generated can drift for kilometers. And then there's the noise and the light disturbance as well. So these gigantic plows essentially going along the seabed introduce massive noise and light pollution into that deep sea environment that's where these species have evolved in that darkness and that silence. So it's hugely impactful, not just to those habitats, but also things like migratory whales, dolphins, turtles. So yeah,
And it's a
huge.
problem, we've been talking, Ruth, about how the beautiful ecosystem is out of sight and out of mind. But of course, deep sea mining itself can be out of sight and out of mind. It's not, or it's not visible to ordinary people in the way that other forms of mining are, and that's obviously a huge problem here.
Yeah, completely.
Great. Well, Ruth, thank you very much. We look forward to throwing loads of questions at you and the other panelists when we get to the Q&A. And if you do want to ask questions about our fantastic panel tonight, or of course, if you just want to make a comment, do so in the chat on YouTube, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So let's go next to our next panelist, who's Alec Taylor, who's Director of Policy and Research for Oceana UK. Alec, good evening. How are you doing, and where are you joining us from?
Yeah, hi Craig. Hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm here from my home, not far from Greenwich, near the Maritime Museum, and right on the
Very
Meridian line. So
very
I
appropriate. And I
feel
notice we're all wearing blue tonight, of course.
yeah.
So it can't be coincidence. Alec, first of all, tell us a bit about Oceana for people that don't know Oceana and the brilliant work you do.
Yeah, so Oceana, we're a global organization. We kind of like to say that we're one of the biggest organizations that just works on the ocean. In the UK, we're a relatively small team. Having said that, we're about 12, 13 people, and we really are relatively new as well. We're only about 2 or 3 years old in the UK space, and we're really trying to add that bold, authentic campaign voice for the change that we need to see. So we have three main campaigns focusing on getting rid of oil and gas production for that energy transition that we need. We look at protecting habitats from destructive fishing. So the bottom trawling issue in particular that has been so resonant over the last 12 months. And more generally, we are campaigning to rebuild fish populations and put an end to overfishing.
Great, fantastic, great. And we're delighted to have you tonight, and great when we've been able to work together. Fantastic. Alec, why don't I met you last at the UN Oceans Conference in Nice back in September. Why don't you talk us through what is the High Seas Treaty?
Yeah, well, it's a massive deal, Greg. It's been many years coming. It's as you said in your introduction, it's a global agreement led by the United Nations just about the conservation and the sustainable use of marine biodiversity in that half of the planet that Ruth mentioned that no country owns. It's really the common heritage of mankind, the common resource that we need to be very careful about how we use. And so for the first time, actually now, we have a set of legally binding rules and regulations that allow us to do things like create marine protected areas in those high seas. So we often talk, for example, about our commitment to 30 by 30 or protecting 30% of the world's ocean. We cannot do that without the mechanism that this high seas treaty provides. So that's one of the big things that this treaty allows us to do. It also sets in place much stronger rules in relation to assessing the environmental impacts of things like deep sea mining and other activities that countries who sign up to the treaty have to abide by. And it also, importantly, it embeds some of those core environmental principles that a lot of us fight so hard to protect. So things like the precautionary principle, the principle that where we don't know what's out there and what, how rich some of these ecosystems are, and we know about those threats from things like deep sea mining, we take action to protect those ecosystems before that damage is done. And so some of those principles are really embedded into that global agreement. It's not to say that the high seas weren't regulated in the past before this treaty has come into place. So we have had, for example, the International Seabed Authority, or the ISA, which has been looking at deep sea mining, but they've been pretty slow on introducing the regulations for deep sea mining, and I'm sure we'll come back to that later on. So this really adds that kind of that global set of binding rules to make sure that we properly protect that 95% of the habitable space on this planet, which is made up of the high seas.
Brilliant. Well, you've given us a very big picture there. Let's zoom in on the UK from a political point of view. Tell us where the UK is at in terms of ratifying the High Seas Treaty into UK law, and why is it relevant for the UK?
Yeah, so the UK is actually playing catch up. It was one of the early signatories to the agreement. It's a bit like organising a party and then forgetting that the party is actually happening and having to kind of frantically get dressed and get a taxi. We've only just started the process of ratifying the High Seas Treaty, so we weren't part of the initial 60 countries that was the benchmark for making this treaty enter into force. We've just passed the first legislation that's needed in the UK to ratify. So we had the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Act, which was passed in the last few weeks. Really welcome news. Unfortunately, we still have 3 more bits of legislation to pass before we can officially send off that ratification envelope to the United Nations. So really the race is on for the UK to get its ratification into the UN before that first meeting of the High Seas Treaty, which may well be as early as August or September this year.
What's been
So
holding up? Why is the UK been dragging its feet?
well, it's hard to say. We had a bit of momentum at various points in times, and then politics got in the way or other things got in the way, and it kind of, as you said, with kind of deep seas being out of sight and out of mind. I think that probably was the case for the legislation to actually get the UK to sign up to the treaty in the first place. So we're really in catch-up mode at the moment, and we're pushing ahead as fast as we can. And I think the UK government is doing its best to get all that legislation and regulation through so it can be an active participant, because even in advance of that first meeting at the United Nations in New York, there will be a lot of discussions about how this treaty is going to be set up. What are the mechanisms for actually enforcing the treaty? What are the rules and regulations about how it's going to work in practice? All of that stuff still needs to be worked out effectively by the countries that are involved. The other thing that's worth saying about the UK situation is that it has officially declared its support for a moratorium on deep sea mining, as within this process, which has been in place since 2023. That's obviously a very welcome position and was not always the case. I remember when David Cameron and the coalition government, they were very interested in exploring for deep sea metals and minerals when they started about 15 years ago. So we've come a long way in terms of shifting the government's position. They do still, however, sponsor 2 licenses for companies to explore for some of these metals and minerals, and they have not yet offered to give those licenses up. So they're talking a good game at the moment, but they are also still sponsoring 2 out of the around 30 exploratory licenses that.
What's the argument they try and advance for how that makes sense?
Well, I think they're also trying to push the scientific case for getting some strong regulations in place to
Right.
allow deep sea mining to take place in the appropriate mechanism. And I think that's part of the involvement with some of those exploratory licenses. But it takes the gloss away slightly from the UK's ocean leadership position, I would say. I know having talked with officials in UK government, they are really keen for the UK to play this leadership position when it comes to ocean conservation. And I do believe that they have the high seas ocean best interests at heart. So it's really, we really just need to make sure that the UK ratifies now as quickly as possible and really plays an active part in some of those early discussions.
Great. All right. Well, Alec, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. And again, looking forward to hearing your thoughts when we get to the Q&A. Remember, if you want to ask a question, just put it in the chat or comment, and we'll get to as many as we can in a little bit. But I want to go now to our next panelist tonight, who's Khadija Stewart from Rise Up for the Oceans. And where are you joining us from tonight?
Hi everyone, Khadija here, and I'm joining from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. So just lovely sunshine, beautiful weather, and I'm here to just send some sunshine to all our UK participants joining in.
Fantastic. Well, I think that slightly beats Cambridge and Cornwall and London, I'm afraid. But anyway, and why don't you tell us, Khadija, a bit about the work of Rise Up for the Oceans? It's an amazing coalition, isn't it?
Yeah, so Rise Up is a global network of over 750 organizations from more than 67 countries committed to ensuring that ocean decision-making processes and policies are shaped by the communities most affected by them. And we have 4 priority areas: PB&J, which is the High Seas Treaty; Deep Sea Protection, which is one of the areas I cover; Ocean and Climate Nexus, again, the next area I cover; and small-scale fisheries.
Fantastic, great. Well, can you talk us through, please, a little bit about the existing regulations? You know, to what extent, if at all, is deep sea mining regulated to date? Talk to us a little bit about the role of things like the International Seabed Authority and the licensing. I mean, Alec just talked about some of the licenses that exist and so on. What's been happening to date?
Yeah, where do we start? So I guess I'll just give a little backstory. So when I first started working on deep sea mining and being from the Caribbean, and I heard that the International Seabed Authority was in Jamaica, I had to ask, well, which Jamaica? Because this could never be the Jamaica in the Caribbean region, because we, as an environmental person, ocean conservation, never heard of the International Seabed Authority. And I first went to the meetings in 2022, yes. And at that point in time, language of a moratorium, a precautionary pause, those were all things that were kind of shunned or banned. Like if you said those words, you had to go and stand in a naughty corner because it was really not something that was welcomed. And thus far, the conversation was more about exploration and just tugging along at the exploitation text, which is the mining code. And what happened was, within the metals company and their push to mine the deep sea, they triggered the 2-year rule underneath NARU, and through NARU. And that is why we're seeing all this pressure now, because a 2-year timeline was given from 2021 to 2023. And it was just like, whoa, we need to complete regulations because we need to mine. And that thankfully did not happen. And there were things put in place, to safeguard that the text is still not where it needs to be, even to this date. Like that was 2021 when that was triggered, and we're 2026 now, and there's over 200 and something pages of just incompleted reg text on every aspect of the regulations. And it's like, if that is the case, then how is it possible that we could be considering going to even mine in the deep sea when there is no legal framework in existence to even begin to want to start to govern this, industry? And yeah, I mean, just absolutely not in a position to see it happening anytime soon, or to see it happening at all. And like I mentioned in the beginning, where the moratorium language was something that was not welcome, now 2026, we have 40 countries calling for it. And the ISAs are I feel like it's just something you have to experience to completely understand. It's the way it is set up and the way that you see certain things being played out. And it's just like, you have to question the integrity of the body. Is it that they're there to fulfill their dual mandate, which yes, is to complete the mining code and develop the language and the text, but they also have the mandate to protect the environment. And I feel like so far it's been heavily tipped on one side, and there's so much of us from the NGO world, from even some governments calling and being like, wait, you have this dual mandate, so let us also focus on the protection of the marine environment. And one way through doing that is with the precautionary pause or moratorium, which is what we have several states calling for. And yeah, I will let you ask me a next question because I can keep going on the.
Well, tell us a little bit more then about specifically the work, the campaigning you've done as Rise Up for the Oceans. How can people support and get involved? And we had a brilliant question from Natalie Fox, says, how can local people stand up against deep sea mining? And I guess the point is this might be people who live a very long way from the sea anyway. So how can people get involved and express what they think about this?
Yeah, so for a lot of, again, I'll start back from my first experience going into the room. And the first time I went, I was the only Caribbean national present as an observer. And to me, that was something that was absolutely absurd because what do you mean? And then I realized so many other people did not have access to the space and did not know what was happening. But this is something that is live stream, like it is lively shown. So I feel like one way that we definitely could start paying attention to it is by joining these live sessions so that we could follow along with the conversation and understand what is being said in the room. Because I mean, it was mentioned earlier that the UK has a moratorium stance, but in the room, the UK does not push this moratorium position in the way that is needed. Or sometimes you hear statements like, indigenous and community local communities is not something that we recognize. And so let's continue chugging along. And with things like that, if you don't know what's happening in the room and you don't know what's being said, then you can't hold your governments and you can't hold people accountable. So I think that is a good start to follow along with what is happening in the room. And then from that, it's very technical. So if you don't want to follow along, I completely understand. There are times when I'm in the room and I zone out because it's like, what is happening? Or you're spending 2 hours listening to a debate about a comma. And that is something that really makes you question your sanity, but it happens.
Yeah.
And with that, I think because there's state representatives in the room that you could start writing your government, sharing your perspectives. Something like deep sea mining is a very difficult concept. And for us in the Caribbean, when I tried at first to share about the topic, people were like, are you talking about oil and natural gas? Because that's the only thing we could conceptualize. And I started with all these information packs, sharing it, and people still didn't 100% connect with it. It was only until we started having art exhibitions. So started showing what is in the deep sea, using videos, using pictures, using things like that, that people started to really connect with the issue in a way, because we are visual people, we are visual beings, and the deep sea, outer side, outer mind. So yeah, just start hosting events, having conversations around the topics. There are several documentaries out now, a listening session to really understand what is going on. And then from there, once you feel like you have some kind of knowledge, then I think it's time, start writing your ministers. There was a global paddle out last year that took place during the time of the council and assembly meeting at the ISA last year in July. We saw plenty of people take to the sea, to make a message, to put out a call for deep sea protection. So with that, I just feel like there's so much little advocacy things that we could continuously do and continuously keep pushing. But it's important to know, because this was something that was going unobserved for so long, that we as a people are watching, because the deep ocean and its resources are supposed to be for the benefit of all humankind. And so we need to make sure the people in the room are representing us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Fantastic. Great to hear from all the panel there. Well, look, in just a couple of moments, we're going to show you a video to tell you a little bit more about deep sea mining. And then when we come out of the video, we're straight into the Q&A. So do make sure you get your questions and comments into us. Although I say that, loads of them are coming in. We had a nice comment from John Walters, said, what an important subject this is. It's great that the Wildlife Trusts are raising this. Thank you, John. And I would say, if you've got particular ideas about subjects for us to focus on in future wildlives, do get in touch. We'd love to hear your thoughts about what they should be. But tonight is all about treasure or trouble. Should we be mining for metals in the deep seas? let's have a little look at a video that shows us a little bit more about what we're talking about.
The basic picture of a deep sea mining operation, more specifically a nodule mining operation, will involve a surface operation vessel. From that will be deployed a collector vehicle that will be down at 4,000 meters, and it will be tethered to the surface operation vessel. Mining of nodules will produce two different types of plumes. One is a sediment plume created by the vehicle removing the top 10 to 15 centimeters of the seabed. We call that a collector plume. It will drive around and pick up the nodules. And they'll be pumped back up a riser pipe to the surface vessel. And the second type of plume is a discharge plume, which is unwanted sediment that is brought up to the surface vessel. It is unwanted, unneeded, and so would be returned to the ocean. The question is whether that's returned as a plume in the mid-water column or back down in the deep ocean.
There we go, telling us a bit more about deep sea mining and actually what's involved. And we are talking very deep in many cases here, several kilometers deep and so on. So we've had some really brilliant questions coming in. So Rowan Lewis has asked the question, how do you legislate or enforce law outside the 200-mile limit or territorial waters? And Michael Goff has asked, how is monitoring and enforcement of this treaty being funded and conducted? Now, Khadija, you mentioned this, touched on this very briefly, how some of the very first early conversations as the treaty comes into force are, and at the very first meeting of it, the very first conference of the parties that's expected sometime later this year, will be focusing around enforcement. What's the thinking so far? I know we're a long way from having this figured out yet, but how do you enforce a global treaty in the high seas outside of national jurisdiction? What are the options?
Okay, so this is not one I can handle. I thought it was more enforcement on the deep sea mining industry in itself. So I would hand over to the BBN chairperson on the call, Alex.
Okay, there we go. Good one.
Okay,
Alex.
I'll jump in. So the High Seas Treaty does have mechanisms in the agreement in relation to enforcement and compliance. Having said that, a lot of the detail, as I mentioned, will be worked out over the next couple of years. And I think that's where there's going to be a lot of kind of soft diplomacy that's needed between the different countries to try and establish a really powerful mechanism for enforcement. And one of the really important dynamics there will be how this High Seas Treaty interacts with organizations like this International Seabed Authority, with the organizations that manage fisheries in some of those high sea areas. Now, the way that the treaty has been worded is that it's explicit that the High Seas Treaty must not undermine the work of those other organizations, but that goes both ways. It's responsible. It places also the onus on those organizations not to undermine the implementation of the treaty itself. And that's again something where the UK has a really important role. It is a member of each of those different organizations, including the ISA, as Khadija said. And actually it should be promoting its moratorium stance and its kind of progressive ocean leadership much more consistently across all of those organizations. So all of this is really to play for in some ways. The other important thing about the High Seas Treaty itself is that it has what's called a clearing mechanism. So it will collect all of the data in relation to things like protections, in relation to things like genetic resources that are being collected, and it will hold them centrally and make them available for people to see. So there is a transparency element which is very important there to hold countries and companies to account.
Yeah,
I just
great.
want to add real quick, sorry to cut you off, Greg, that
No, go for it.
yeah, just as Alex mentioned that, the High Seas Treaty is not supposed to interfere with the work of the International Seabed Authority, but it kind of covers, the entire water column. And something that is coming up in the meeting in March next month is actually the conversation of how it's on the agenda, how the High Seas Treaty now is playing a role on the proposed industry of deep sea mining. So that is something to also look out for, because in the past, whenever BB&J will come up in the room, it will be like, this has nothing to do with BB&J, leave us alone, like let us move on and focus on what is being said. But now that the treaty is real and very much, ready to take off, now they could no longer avoid the conversation. So just wanted to flag that is on the agenda for this upcoming meeting.
Absolutely. And there are, obviously some really significant countries and economies that sadly have not yet signed up to it and ratified it. No big surprise at the moment, the US, unfortunately, but also China, I think, has not yet done so. Canada, Australia, where are they at? I mean, where are we at? I mean, these are, it's great that we have got this kind of coalition of a good chunk of countries that are doing this, but we're a very long way from getting the kind of numbers we ideally need. That's right, isn't it, Alec?
Yeah, we certainly don't have every country ratifying the treaty, and as you said, there are some quite notable emissions and some quite dangerous precedents being set by some of those countries in relation to deep sea mining. I think that is probably the case for a lot of other international treaties, the climate talks being a notable example. And in those situations, I think the kind of probably one of the approaches there is to identify those countries that are willing to lead and expose those countries that are not playing by the rules. We are in a very tough geopolitical situation for multilateralism generally. I mean, if ever there was an area of the planet in need of a globally binding treaty, I think it is the high seas.
Yeah.
And I think it would be great if countries could put their individual differences aside for the purposes of conserving this magical common heritage that we have. But yeah, there are a lot of areas within countries' own waters which are also suitable for deep sea mining, and there the High Seas Treaty doesn't apply in the same way. And America is probably the notable example where it does want to exploit some of its own waters for some of these minerals and metals. But certainly, yeah, we really need to give this initial couple of years of the High Seas Treaty as much support as we can to make sure that we get some of those mechanisms up and running.
Yeah. Well, it's worth noting. I mean, obviously the US is now not in the climate agreement, and in fact, the US has never been in the Convention on Biological Diversity either, which is a problem. Maybe we should start placing tariffs on countries that don't sign up to these. You never know, just a thought there. But Ruth, the problem is let's face it, problems around enforcement and the political will needed to make these things happen. It's not as if that's a problem exclusively for the deep seas or the high seas, is it? I mean, it happens within our national jurisdiction as well. I mean, here in UK waters, it's not as if we see anything like enough enforcement or marine protected area designations being treated seriously either.
Exactly. The High Seas Treaty's got ambitions, like Alex said in his piece earlier, to try and help strive towards 30 by 30, but we're not anywhere near that in our own UK domestic waters. And that's out to 200 nautical miles. We're still a long way off that in terms of effective management. We still allow bottom trawling in a lot of our seabed MPAs where those features are supposed to be protected. So we've still got work to do. And we don't have a spatial plan for our seas of where all of these different industries, whether that be fishing, mining, aggregate dredging, nature protection areas. We don't have that vision yet of how all of these uses of the sea and needs of our sea and our resource can fit together in that jigsaw puzzle. So yeah, we've got a way to go in domestic management and enforcement and legislation. But hopefully the two can marry up between the sort of the domestic world and the High Seas Treaty. You know, maybe the High Seas Treaty with all of those other countries involved might help to pull up some of the domestic legislation and get things managed a bit more quickly and efficiently.
Absolutely. And of course, enforcement doesn't, obviously, if a country hasn't ratified the treaty anyway, then it's not necessarily going to recognize that enforcement. But, you know, of course, ultimately, so much of international law comes down to international diplomacy and international pressure. And, you know, it's amazing how it can work, even when people say it doesn't at all. So I had lots of great kind of questions coming in. Jane Giffords has said, will deep sea mining be green if it disrupts these habitats? Or is it a political green so that people get electric cars, which considering construction are not that green? Well, I think exactly. I mean, electric vehicles, they're generally they're definitely a move forward in some senses on petrol and diesel cars, but you know they're certainly not a panacea. And actually, the best thing is to travel less and have modal shifts and more cycling and walking and use of public transport and so on. That's unquestionably the case. Michael Goffer said, "Who's going to fund monitoring and enforcement if individual nations go rogue?" Exactly. Bernie says, "How would deep sea mining regulations prohibition be enforced effectively again?" Things like that. You know, there's a lot of these kind of questions coming in. And, you know, actually, how do we push this up the political agenda here in the UK? Chris says, what can we do to raise this as potentially existential issue? Do we need to write to MPs or what? So, you know, here in the UK, I mean, Khadija was telling us a bit more earlier about what's happening all around the world. But what would you say, Ruth, Alec, particularly here in the UK? How can we build up the pressure so that the UK government is higher on their agenda? And indeed, there's a lot more recognition of this.
I think from my point of view, it's writing to your MPs and the ministers to try and get that urgency that we need to you know, get this piece of legislation ratified. You know, there's a promise by the minister at United Nations in June that this would happen, and it's taken until now to get royal assent, and we're still not there. We still need that secondary legislation, and it just needs that little bit of urgency. Otherwise, we're going to miss our place at the table at that first COP. And you know, that should be enough to incentivize UK getting things sped up a little bit. So yeah, I think write to your MPs, write to your minister to try and push this up the political agenda, that people, it's not outside out of mind. People are impassioned about this and want the government to take action and make a stand and try and better protect our high seas and those areas beyond national jurisdiction. So yeah, that would be my take. And yeah, just keep that lobbying voice loud and clear.
And Alec, a lot of people would have heard of the word COP, and lots of people associate it with the climate talks. In fact, sometimes people think COP stands for something to do with climate. Actually, it stands for Conference of the Parties. And so every UN treaty has a conference of the parties for that treaty, which is why, you know, we just had COP 30, I think, wasn't it, for the climate talks, and we've got COP 17 for the nature, the Convention on Biological Diversity at the end of this year. But what we're going to have this year will be COP 1, isn't it, for the new UN High Seas Treaty, effectively. And do we know when that's going to be yet, Alec, or where even?
Well, we don't have an exact date. I think it partly depends on when the rooms are available in the UN building.
So it's likely to be New York.
It's likely to be in New York. The most likely time, I think, will be around September, around the UN General Assembly, and you know, but that could change. And we don't know exactly the date. But as Ruth said, you know, ultimately, if the UK wants to be at that meeting, it has to give itself enough time to pass all the legislation, then wait a few weeks, then post the envelope to the UN, and then there's a period of approval. And you know, there are various hoops to jump through before the UK can get that seat at the table.
Which effectively means before summer recess for Parliament. So it's going to be done. We're not talking in July or August because Parliament is in recess then. So we're talking getting it done before June.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that is achievable, but I think it will be tight. The first COP itself it'll be an interesting event. It'll obviously be a massive moment for all of the people, the campaigners and the governments that have been pushing for this treaty to come into force for so many years. But actually the detail of it will be really about how the treaty is going to work in practice. It will actually be quite a technical set of discussions, I think. And as Khadija said, some of these meetings are actually so confusing and jargony, and actually can kind of drain your energy even by simply being part of them. But I think for all of us, I think we have to really hold on to the hope of what this treaty can deliver. It can really deliver the protections that we need for some of those amazing ecosystems. So, the Sargasso Sea, for example, in the Atlantic, really connected to us in the UK by the eels that swim across the Atlantic in order to spawn and come back to the
Sargasso
UK.
Sea, for people that don't know, it's near Bermuda, basically, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's really named after the sargassum kind of algae or kelp that kind of gather on the surface, and it's a hugely important biodiversity hotspot. And for the first time now, we can properly protect it through the mechanisms that are provided by this treaty, and also the hydrothermal vents that Ruth mentioned, and some of those amazing ecosystems. That is what we're pushing for, to get the protections in place by that 2030 deadline, so we can actually meet some of those 30 by 30 commitments on the
You were
ocean.
telling a story there, Alec, absolutely, how this is so connected. Sometimes it seems like these international things are far away, but the eels that go to the Sargasso Sea to breed, isn't it? Then they swim back to British Isles, into places like Loch Ness, that beautiful but highly polluted loch in the middle of Northern Ireland, or round into the East Anglia to Ely, of course. The town of Ely is named after eels, and they kind of they're found there, and then they go back to the Sargasso Sea and so on. So this is intimately connected with UK wildlife, and it would be appalling, wouldn't it? Let's face it, if COP1 happens of the UN High Seas Treaty and the UK is not there because it hasn't got around to doing what it said it was going to do. This surely has to be a moment where we build up pressure to get the UK to do this, but also to just put attention on this whole issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if the UK is not there in that first COP, it'll be a really bad look for a country that is actually the kind of the co-chair of the High Ambition Coalition for the Ocean. So I think we've all got a job to do. Let's all push our politicians and governments to get that ratification process as fast as possible.
Absolutely. So Khadija, you were talking about this earlier, and I want to come back to you on this really important topic. We've had a question from Elaine Padden. As she says, does the Wildlife Trust have a strategy or view on the increasingly restricted rights to campaign? That's a very good question, but actually that's not the one I meant to read out. Sorry. We can come back to, I can say something on that in a moment. But also, so there was a question about fishing communities. Here we are, sorry. There was a question from Sylvia Roda, and I was going to put this to you, Khadija. It says that I'll come back to yours in a minute, Elaine. With the UN High Seas Treaty now in force, what mechanisms exist to ensure that equity and the rights of fishing dependent communities are safeguarded in discussions about deep sea mining, or let's be honest, about anything to do with the management of the oceans? And I know you as Rise Up do an awful lot of work, huge amount of work with fishers around the world, don't you? In fact, fishing communities are part of your federation.
Yes, and I wish Shubhaja was here, who's our fisheries expert that manages that portfolio, and would have been able to give an incredible answer. But for me, that is just like heavily focused on deep sea mining. This is a next one that is somewhat outside of my scope. Yeah.
But there is a really important thing, isn't it, about protecting and involving the rights of fishers around the world, and particularly we're talking small scale fishers. Obviously you have the big industrial trawlers that cause such problems, such blight, vacuum out huge amounts of fish from the oceans, but actually small scale fisheries are millions of people, hundreds of millions of people worldwide are dependent on small scale local fisheries.
Yeah, and also making sure that they just have a say in the development of some of these things. So recently we've been, and I'll just bring this back to deep sea mining a little bit. There's been a scope of, again, who has been in the room and who hasn't been in the room and who has been contributing to the conversations. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the small scale fisher voices are very much absent. And this is an industry that has the potential to affect fisheries in a big way and affect livelihoods and affect people. So the question now is just like how do we as Rise Up and other organizations find ways to engage fishers in these conversations and to make sure it is meaningful engagement and that their voices and their rights and everything, their concerns and their pushback and what they want in the regulations, what they don't want, etc. Happens because fishing is something that is essential to most, if not all, economies, even landlocked countries as well. So it's important that we safeguard that industry because, I mean, when we spoke about the impacts of deep sea mining earlier, this is one area that is definitely going to feel it more than anything else. And I know that there's so much that we don't know, but there are studies done on the tuna industry already and the possible impacts of that. And that's just the start. So, yeah.
I'd sort of support that as well, Craig. I think it's this uncertainty that we've talked about already, and it's the same as the eels and that whole sort of connectedness. There's no barriers, there's no boundaries in the marine environment, and we just don't know how deep sea mining is going to impact that ecosystem at maybe a local level, but how that changes things on a much more global sort of level and changes to food chains and food webs and plankton productivity and all sorts of things could be impacted that then reflects back onto those inshore and small scale fishers. So it's this uncertainty that we need to bottom out before we can go any further with this discussion. We've got to take the precautionary approach until then.
Absolutely. Alec.
Yeah, I guess one of the fundamental questions at the moment is who actually is benefiting from deep sea mining, because it certainly isn't the global south. It certainly isn't the communities or small scale fishers. It's the speculators, it's the investors that are banking on a very volatile industry and running away with the profits and leaving countries and taxpayers to foot the bill. And it's basically speculation and without regulation at the moment. That's all it is. It's people dress it up as a shiny, sexy new thing, but it's no more than it's a boom and bust industry at the moment, which completely lacks any effective regulation. The High Seas Treaty will help. It will help with things like properly assessing the environmental impacts. But until the ISA really nails that mining code and set of regulations that Khadijah's been fighting so hard to get through the ISA, I think there's no way we can even get started on deep sea mining for all the reasons that are so clear to those of us watching.
Yeah, just to give as you mentioned, who benefits and the potential fallout. Just to give a quick example of the fact that Papua New Guinea had a trial run with this industry many years ago, and they lost over $120 million, and the government and the public were the ones who had to deal with that fallout, and the industry just upped and left and went, and so there's been failure recorded in the past. So it's just like, why are we trying to push an experiment with livelihoods, economies, and so much more that it's just not worth it? Yeah,
absolutely. Now, of course, the argument is sometimes put, well, we need deep sea mining to enable all these renewables and a clean economy and so on. But of course, this is often put in governments in countries where we've utterly failed to deliver a circular economy. We don't see the political effort being put into really generating circular economy. Even simple things like recycling, we're nowhere near where we could be in all of that. And of course, then there are climate impacts from deep sea mining, and all kinds of exploitation of the oceans in itself causes climate impacts. And Ruth, you might want to tell us about the work that the Wildlife Trust did with WWF and RSPB and others. Okay, not so much in the deep seas, but around the coast of the British Isles, looking at blue carbon that we were able to calculate just in relatively shallow waters around the UK.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we published the findings of that last year, or actually at the end of 2024 now. And yeah, the findings were that we have 240 million tons of carbon stored in just the top 10 centimetres of our seabed sediments around the whole of the UK. And that's a relatively sort of conservative estimate. And obviously that's just the top little bit, and there's vast stores of carbon underneath that, but the data just doesn't isn't there for us to analyze just yet. So it shows the incredible value of those seabed sediments, the less sexy muds, and how important they are in terms of storing that carbon, and consequently helping us to absorb some of the CO2 that we're producing as a human race. And things like bottom trawling, but also deep sea mining, development pressures, anything that disturbs that seabed sediment releases that carbon and counters that climate mitigation effect. So yeah, we've got to look after that seabed, and we're learning all the time about the carbon fluxes. You know, there's a new report that's just been about to be published tomorrow, I believe, by CFAS, and a whole partnership approach on looking more at the anthropogenic impacts to that carbon store and how those fluxes change, and that's going to be a really useful follow-on from our own report, which was the sort of the scope and the scale of carbon stored around our UK seabeds. But you know, the impacts and how much of that is released through some of these disturbance activities will then help hopefully inform some of policy going forwards in terms of better environmental impact assessment processes, building blue carbon into our marine protected area, management network, all those sorts of things that we're really striving and pushing towards.
And the overall point here is, I mean, that's even in the coastal region. But I mean, the fact is, we know so little about just how much carbon is stored in our ocean sediments worldwide, whether we're talking at more shallow areas or deeper levels. We know so little about, you know, aspects about how the oceans work. So to kind of mess it up like this, it could have massive climate impacts itself. So look, we need to come to an end, I'm afraid. We've run out of time. So I want to come to each of you for the sort of last few thoughts and comments. I wonder if I can come to you first, Alec. If you can still see me, I think I've lost some of you actually. No, you're there. Good. Can you still see me? I lost you because my monitor went off. Sorry. I kicked the lead at the back too energetically in my excitement. Alec, if I can come to you first, I mean, what if you suddenly found yourself, you know, in front of the UK cabinet here in the country, Keir Starmer and the Environment Secretary Emma Reynolds and so on, what would be a very clear political message to them about what they need to do on this agenda right now?
Well, I think let's celebrate how important the ocean is and how fragile it is and how many impacts there are both domestically and internationally that are connected by those eels and other animals that swim between those artificial boundaries. Let's get the UK ratifying as soon as possible so that we can play that active part in the first meeting of the High Seas Treaty in September. And yeah, let's just, I mean, for those of us as ocean campaigners, let's take a moment to celebrate this process being where it is. You know, we've come struggling to get this treaty into place, but we have this opportunity now to cement the protection of the high seas into the future, and respecting all of those voices and communities that sit on the outskirts of it, and that's something to be cherished. And I think hopefully the UK can play a leadership role going forward on that.
Brilliant. And Khadija, this really has been an extraordinary coming together of civil society globally, from the global north, global south, people across many cultures arguing for why this is such an important treaty. We've got to get on with it, haven't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. And not just UK, everybody else who have not ratified, and then we really have to fight to make sure we find ways to use the treaty, and we have that deep sea protection in the era of BBNG. And now that we have the ISA meeting coming up next month, and there is a push from the Secretariat to just learn as we go, to ignore the fact that we have incomplete regulations, to ignore the fact that there's so much that we don't know, and to just, yeah, guys, we'll just learn as we go. Like, to have such a massive experiment with, like I said, with economies, with people, with livelihoods, with the marine environment is just absolutely absurd and ridiculous. And the BBNJ agreement is something that would definitely help in ensuring the protection of the deep sea. But all of us, we also have a collective role to play in this. And like I said, make sure we're watching, make sure we're holding our governments and our leaders accountable. And if it is you like more information on how to get food involved, at Rise Up, we are launching a toolkit ahead of this ISA meeting to really push back on the I don't even want to talk about it, to just push back on the desire to greenlight this experiment. And for more news and updates, because I will be there in Jamaica next month on the ground, reporting on what is happening. Sign up to our newsletter so that you're really able to stay informed and get more involved in our campaign efforts against deep sea mining.
Brilliant, thank you. And Ruth, back to you for the final word. I mean, the Wildlife Trusts, we're obviously known for our work on land, whether we're talking beavers or nature-friendly farming or our thousands of nature reserves on land. But we have a huge amount of marine work, don't we? Hundreds and hundreds of people across the Wildlife Trust working all time on marine. And tell us, why is it so important for us as the Wildlife Trust to talk about the deep sea when we're actually locally based?
Because it's all connected. Everything is connected. So impacts inland will flow down those rivers. It'll impact the coastal seas, and it's all flowing. And the whole of the marine ecosystem is joined up. And just because the deep sea is out of sight, it can't be out of mind. And what we're doing within the local wildlife trusts and our national sort of strategic policy and advocacy work, it's all joined up. And I think that's what we need to do globally as well, is join up from local to national to now international, and really start preserving that last sort of reserve, those deep sea areas, because it is a lot of the unknown, and until we know more about what that possibility of that ecosystem holds, then we've got to try and preserve it and take a bit more of a precautionary approach, and look after it globally as well as locally.
And just remember that if you're concerned about eels in Loch Ness in Northern Ireland, or if you're concerned about eels in the fens near Ely in the east of England, then you should also be concerned about deep sea mining. Well, look, it's been a fantastic conversation tonight. I want to make sure that you know that we've got more wildlife coming up this year in March. On Monday the 16th, we have a wildlife called the UK's Missing Giants and why we need them back, looking at the big five, the species that are missing from the UK, but why we need them back. And that won't be hosted by me, that will be hosted by our own big beast of UK wildlife, Rob Stoneman. So do make sure you sign up for that. That's going to be a fantastic conversation, and we've got a brilliant panel coming together for that. And obviously also sign up to our events mailing list to hear about upcoming events like Wildlives. So scan the QR code on the screen right now, and as we play out tonight, if you want to be able to do that. And if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, of course do that, and our other social media across the Wildlife Trust, so that you can join all of these fantastic events live or watch them on catch up. But really, just to close tonight, I want to say a huge thank you to our fantastic panel that's helped us navigate through the deep seas. Alec Taylor from Oceana UK, Khadija Stewart from Rise Up for the Oceans, and our very own Ruth Williams, Head of Marine Conservation at the Wildlife Trusts. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this important conversation. And do remember, if you're motivated by what you hear, do something. Write to your MP, tell a friend, just don't do nothing. Thank you and good night.